The late philosopher William Rowe put forward an evidential argument from evil against the existence of God that focused on the apparent existence of gratuitous evils. In this video, I will briefly explain Rowe's argument, then launch an objection to a key inference in the argument through appealing to skeptical theism. I will end by noting the scope of skeptical theism in undermining evidential arguments from evil. Rowe's argument runs as follows. Premise 1. There are many instances of apparently gratuitous suffering. Premise 2. Therefore, probably, some instances of apparently gratuitous suffering are actually gratuitous, from 1. Noseium inference. Premise 3. If God exists, then gratuitous suffering does not exist. Conclusion, therefore, probably, God does not exist. Before we evaluate Rowe's premises, we must define gratuitous suffering. An instance of suffering is gratuitous if and only if it could have been prevented without thereby losing out on some greater good, or permitting some suffering equally bad or worse. With this in mind, premise 1 seems uncontroversially true. There are certainly instances of suffering that seem or appear gratuitous. An example that was often used by Rowe was of a fawn burning to death in the forest after a bolt of lightning strikes a dead tree. This suffering certainly doesn't appear to be part of some larger plan or greater good. Many similar situations probably occur constantly all over the world, and it is by no means intuitively obvious how they can be justified. So premise 1 is secure. Premise 3 is also plausible. In fact, it might just follow straightforwardly from God's perfect goodness. If God allows suffering that isn't for some greater good, or the avoidance of some equally bad or worse outcome, then he has allowed pointless suffering, and such suffering is wildly in conflict with the absolute moral perfection of God. Premise 2 is where the most pushback for theists is, especially skeptical theists, particularly the inference from premise 1 to premise 2. This inference, dubbed a Noseium inference, is precisely the inference that skeptical theism attacks. The inference goes from the existence of inscrutable suffering to the existence of gratuitous suffering. So let's take a closer look at skeptical theism. Skeptical theism can be summarized as follows. We have no good reason to think that the goods and evils that we know are connected to some instance of evil are representative in respect to the value of the actual goods and evils that are connected to said instance of evil. Now notice the two central parts of this thesis. 1. We should be in doubt about whether the goods we know of constitute a representative sample of all the goods there are. And 2, we should be in doubt about whether each good we know of is such that the necessary conditions of its realization we know of are all there are. As stated before, this thesis is taken to undermine the key inference in Rowe's evidential argument from evil. Why? Well, since we should be in doubt about whether the goods and their necessary conditions of realization that we know of are representative of the goods and their necessary conditions of realization that there are, we cannot infer from our lack of knowledge of a morally justifying reason for some apparent suffering E that there probably is not one. Put technically, if we found no X in our sample S, and we have reason to doubt that S is representative in respect to X, then our not finding X in S is not good evidence for there being no X at all. Therefore, we should be agnostic on the inference from 1 to 2 in Rowe's evidential argument from evil. So if skeptical theism is true, then Rowe's argument fails. But why think skeptical theism is true? Let's start on the intuitive level. Human knowledge is always growing. There is a great deal we still don't know. We are also making moral progress, so we are discovering moral goods along the way. This is not the case with God. God has exhaustive knowledge of all moral goods, while we have a limiting scope. Thus, it is not surprising for there to be moral goods that God is aware of, yet we are not aware of. Take the analogy of a child at the dentist. A child who goes to the dentist is subject to many instances of suffering for which it appears to them that there is no apparent justifying reason for their suffering. However, the child is not justified to therefore form the conclusion that probably there is no apparent justifying reason for their suffering because of their limited scope. The point is this: compared to God, we are epistemic toddlers. However, this intuitive approach can leave much to be desired, so allow me to present a direct argument for skeptical theism, formulated by philosopher Perry Hendricks. Consider the following thesis. Connection. If 1. S knows some event E occurred, 2. S has no good reason to think there is no state of affairs X connected to E, such that S knows nothing significant about X, then 3. S has no good reason to think that there is no X connected to E, such that the value of X is inscrutable to S. Connection seems rather obvious. If I know nothing significant about X, then the value of X will no doubt be inscrutable to me. Let us say that a state of affairs is inscrutable just in case we know nothing significant about it. Rephrased then, connection states that the value of an inscrutable state of affairs is inscrutable. Nothing objectionable here. Now consider the next thesis, preclusion. If for some event E that S knows of, she has no good reason to think that there is no inscrutable states of affairs connected to E, then S has no good reason to think that the value of the states of affairs connected to E that she knows of are representative of the value of the states of affairs actually connected to E. So is preclusion also true? Well, if I have no good reason to think that there is no state of affairs X such that A, X is inscrutable, and B, X is connected to E, then I have no good reason for thinking that all states of affairs connected to E fall within the same range of value. So preclusion is also clearly true. Finally, consider event. For any event, good, evil, or ordinary, E, we have no good reason to think that there is no inscrutable states of affairs connected to E. While some event we know of may appear to have no connection to inscrutable states of affairs, this does not justify the conclusion that there are no states of affairs connected to it. We have no good reason for thinking that some event we know of is not connected to an inscrutable states of affairs. This is because many connections are separated by long periods of time, making it more difficult to perceive them. For example, there is a long period of time between smoking consistently and getting cancer, which makes it more difficult to see the connection between these states of affairs. Moreover, many connections have not yet occurred, such as connections between current events and future states of affairs. Many current events are connected to states of affairs that have obtained in the past, making it all the more difficult to discern them. For example, World War II ended the way it did largely due to Winston Churchill's actions. So we can have confidence that event is true. Now with these three theses, we can formulate a direct argument for skeptical theism. Premise 1. For any E we know of, we have no good reason for thinking that there are not inscrutable states of affairs connected to E, from event and connection. Premise 2. Therefore, for any E we know of, we have no good reason to think that the states of affairs we know are connected to E are representative in respect to the value of the actual states of affairs connected to E, from premise 1 and preclusion. Conclusion, therefore, skeptical theism, from 2. Premise 1 follows straightforwardly from the combination of event and connection, and premise 2 follows from premise 1 and preclusion. The inference to skeptical theism from premise 2 might not be so clear, so let me explain. Instances of evil referred to in skeptical theism are just particular events, and the thesis of event and connection, therefore, entail that for any instance of evil, an event, we have no good reason to think that there are no inscrutable states of affairs connected to it. So here we have a direct argument for skeptical theism. And as I have shown, skeptical theism entails that Rowe's evidential argument from evil fails. Skeptical theism undermines all evidential arguments from evil that rely on the noseium inference, which goes from instances of apparent gratuitous suffering to actual cases of gratuitous suffering. Now, many atheists object to skeptical theism on the basis that it entails an untenable level of skepticism. We will deal with these concerns in a future video, so I'll put those issues aside for now. Many people believe that explanatory versions of the evidential argument from evil, such as the one put forward by Paul Draper and Trent Doherty, are immune to skeptical theistic objections. This may or may not be true, though it is worth noting that philosopher Daniel Snyder has recently argued that Doherty's argument seems to rely on a noseum inference, and thus is susceptible to skeptical theism, and he has also offered criticisms of Draper's argument. In any case, it is clear that skeptical theism undermines Rowe's evidential argument from evil, and all others that rely on similar inferences. In my next video, I will defend skeptical theism against contemporary objections.